So
I found that the most powerful computer in the year 2000 was the ASCII White, and it was around like 7 teraflops of computing power, which is essentially 7 trillion operations a second. One crazy fact I found was that the 1080 Ti graphics card, which came out in 2016, 16 years after the ASCII White, has essentially the equivalent computing power as the supercomputer. So there's a 16-year gap between the most powerful computer in the world, which costs like multiple millions of dollars. It required 3 megawatts of power to run it and another 3 megawatts of power to cool it, versus a graphics card from 16 years later is the same computing power.
this episode describes an interview with Teddy, the creator of the YouTube channel Branch Education, which focuses on deep diving into engineering and technology topics using animation. Teddy started the channel in 2018 after working in the semiconductor industry, particularly on ion implanters. He emphasizes the gap in high school engineering education and aims to provide detailed yet accessible educational content. This episode outlines how he makes his videos, including the extensive research and 3D modeling in Blender, and discusses the future of branch education, hoping to create a high school engineering curriculum. Welcome to Inspiring Computing. This podcast is where computing meets the real world. Inspiring Computing aims to trigger your curiosity by talking to proficient and advanced MATLAB, Python, and Julia users who use these tools to deepen their understanding of the world around them by simulating it, exploring trade-offs, and gaining insights that help their companies add more value. In addition to proficient users, we will be talking to product marketing, toolbox authors, package developers, and library maintainers to see what drives their development and what issues they're solving for others to benefit from. Welcome, Teddy, to Inspiring Computing.
Hello.
So I've been wanting to have you on the show for a while. I'm a big fan of your YouTube channel, Branch Education. Ever since I saw your YouTube channel, I've always thought, hey, this Teddy guy, he must be super interesting to create these awesome videos. Before we get into branch education and the process and why you created this YouTube channel, can you maybe tell me a little bit about your superhero origin story? Who are you and how did you even get started with branch education?
Yeah, so I started branch education in 2018 roundabout. And I guess my superhero origin story, I worked in the semiconductor industry. Specifically, I worked on ion implanters, which are one of the machines that makes microchips. So I was an engineer for pretty much 8 years, and I got to travel to various semiconductor fabs in South Korea. And I really got to dive into the wild world of semiconductor manufacturing. I worked on ion implanters. They are garage-sized tools, and they make the transistors themselves, and they specifically dope the silicon to be P-type or N-type using phosphor or boron or other elements. And it's a very high-tech tool, and it requires this massive garage because they accelerate the phosphor and boron to relativistic speeds so that you can implant firing a baseball into a wall, 6 feet into a wall is the analogy we always used.
So how did you actually get started with that? I'm assuming you didn't go to high school and said, hey, I want to go and work for a company that makes ion implanters. How did you go from the 15-year-old Teddy curious about the world to that?
Yeah, that's a great question because actually, interestingly, I went to 2 high schools concurrently, and one high school was for like English, history, and Spanish as well as what I took for my language. And then I, at the same time, went to a separate high school that was like 30-minute drive away. And the high school was focused on math and science and also had a good component of engineering. I got to take extra courses in engineering, and I, at a high school age, got really curious as to what photonics or nuclear engineering or robotics or electronics. I went to 2 high schools concurrently and then went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute where I did both mechanical and electrical engineering at the same time, which is like the trend of trying to do 2 things at the same time yet again. And then pretty much after graduating college, then just stumbled upon at a career fair the company Varian Semiconductor and applied and got a job offer. Honestly, the direction into the semiconductor was just like, I got a job. That sounds great. This is good. So I wasn't specifically like focusing out that industry, but I'm really happy that it ended that way.
And then you started working in this industry, but then you became a YouTuber, right? So your YouTube channel is just short of a couple of million of subscribers. So how did you go from this technical whiz kid who is doing not one high school, but two at the same time and then 2 degrees at the same time? Was this following the same philosophy that during your day job, you said, oh, I can do more, and then you started YouTube on the side? Is that what happened, or tell me more?
Yeah, it was a long process, actually. Started working at Varian, which eventually 2 years later was acquired by Applied Materials. So just I call it Applied Materials now because for the majority of my time there, it was Applied Materials. So started working at Applied Materials, and then probably 2 years in, I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do, but then I started getting into YouTube classes like Crash Course History by Hank and John Green, who are like really started the space of education on YouTube, and thought pretty quickly that I was like, hey, this is amazing for history and science, but there really isn't a great engineering course on YouTube. Like, there isn't great instructional engineering that is specific and detailed as to how technology works. But at the same time, was still working, and I actually really loved working at Applied Materials and would definitely still be there if there was a good industry of engineering education. So it was much more the fact that there was a gap I knew that needed to be filled. In the meantime, I took not really a detour, like trying to figure out what I needed to do of how to get this engineering course started. So I actually went to Harvard University for night school for about 3 years and then got my master's there. And then after finishing Harvard, I was like, okay, what should I do now? And then I tried to do talking to the camera type sort of videos and formats, quite similar to what Hank and John Green were doing. And I was pretty much horrible in front of a camera. I didn't exactly know all the steps I needed to take to learn to get better at talking to a camera. So then I decided, hey, why not try animation? So then I spent about 2 years learning Blender animation.
Wow. So then with the Blender animation, that's what is powering all of your branch education YouTube videos? Is it all Blender?
Yep, it's pretty much 100% Blender. Our audio editing in Reaper before using Blender, and then we do Adobe Premiere after. But those are just the 2% of the work on either side is outside of Blender, though. It's definitely 96% Blender.
So maybe do you want to explain a little bit more of what branch education actually is?
Yeah, of course. Branch education is a engineering YouTube instructional channel or engineering educational channel where we dive deep into technology and how engineering is used to implement technology. So my favorite topics are things like how solid state drives work and explaining specifically how binary ones and zeros are stored in physical structures of solid state drive in your smartphone. Other topics we get into are how the speaker in your phone works and like how it physically moves up and down and pushes the air and creates sound waves. Some of our recent, more successful videos have been on how video game graphics work and like how whenever you play a video game, the exact algorithm that is used to generate video game graphics. And then other ones are how Bluetooth works or how JPEG compression works. And it's all these very engineering and technology focused topics, but diving into them, the specifics of how they work, but at the same time making it very accessible to a general audience and not using a lot of technical jargon.
So I'm an electrical engineer. Typically, these things are touched upon with a certain degree of complexity or detail at university, but maybe not quite. So is that why you created the channel, to make it easier for 18-year-olds who are just starting electrical and mechanical engineering? Or is it more that you're thinking, what, in high school, I wish someone had told me this so that I would have made a more informed decision of what I should study for? Or what was the
Mhm.
thinking around here when you say make it accessible for more folk?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The core dream behind branch education is to create a high school engineering curriculum that explains AP level engineering, which is advanced placement for outside of the US. It's a very complicated and deep high school course on engineering, diving into the various elements of engineering. At least how it is in the US is that high school engineering is not really a strong, rigorous curriculum or a strong course. And it's pretty much just all project based and working in teams, which is, I need to emphasize, like, that's a great and wonderful skill to develop at a young age, but it doesn't dive into the specifics and technical details of engineering when you actually get to college or university. As an electrical engineer, you're like, oh my gosh, these are the hardest courses. Like, I am super struggling at these courses. And I think that one of the key reasons is that there isn't a introduction or a preliminary set of courses for high school building up to those complicated courses that you're just thrown in the deep end in college.
It's also true that for high school teachers, it's almost an unfair ask, right? So there's this idea that, okay, at high school, you prepare for university, but it feels like technology is evolving at such a fast pace. And if you didn't work and study in the semiconductor industry, it's really a tough call to get a high school teacher to explain, okay, this is how your computer works. And how does actually sound work from a speaker? The average person might know maybe there's some air vibrations that, and then it stops.
Yeah.
Or maybe you have kids and you've watched, I don't know, the Magic School Bus.
I loved the Magic School Bus. The Magic School Bus is like exactly the inspiration, where it's this is introductory courses using like 2D but like 3D because they dive into things.
My son loves the Magic School Bus and I find it very inspiring. But so you mentioned earlier, Teddy, that the ultimate goal of branch education is to help high school kids have a deeper understanding, and maybe not the average one, but maybe the more technical minded or engineering minded folk. So walk me through what that world looks like. So does this mean that my kids or my great grandchildren, when they get to 17, 18, should they stop looking at their high school teachers for information and they should revert to YouTube? Is that what you're thinking about? Or what does that world look like? Tell me.
Great question. And I think the best way to think of branch education and the videos I'm created is a lot more like a textbook. These videos will be like what you watch at home and understand at home. And then when you go into the classroom, your teacher will be like discussing the textbook / video that you watched the prior night, or potentially the video game that you played where you like tore apart a rocket, the SpaceX rocket at home. And they'll discuss the various components and then maybe add like in-school activities. So I think a very key and fun element of this in-school activity would be a smartphone dissection or just a dead technology dissection where it's like, hey, these things are already dead. Why not put them to educational purposes?
I see. So is the idea, so there's a couple of things there. So there's, let's say I'm a high school kid, love playing a computer game. And then you challenge someone, say, so how does a computer game work? How does your graphics card look so real? What makes it so real? Is the idea that you challenge people to think, okay, so how is a computer rendering light and mimicking light? And then is the idea that then you show a video how your computer graphics work. And I think you have a video on trains and the lighting and the different phases and the different computations, that someone would watch that. And then is the idea that a teacher then comes to the class and say, let's play around a little bit with this and do what if scenarios, and should we change things to deepen everyone's understanding, so that you're giving a framework for teachers who don't necessarily need to spend the weeks and months that you spend reading books to have a clear description of how a graphics engine works. Is that the idea?
That's exactly it. Like, really, to give all the tools. I think it's incredibly difficult for a teacher to just pick up like an entire engineering degree on the nights and weekends. That's not a feasible thing. But I think it is possible to be like, hand them a completely built curriculum with all the lectures and homeworks and quizzes and things like that, and then be like, hey, let's train you, teacher, on how to teach this for a few nights every week for a few months and things like that, and then offer a course on engineering and technology. So I think it would start as a extracurricular class, or like an elective class on AP engineering for high school, and then it would hopefully evolve into a required class that fits somewhere in the like science/engineering sets of curriculums throughout the high school.
So often I remember that when I talk to teachers, they always say, we don't have time, and if I have to teach something else, I have to drop something. So as the world becomes more complex, not an uncommon thing that people say, it's just so complex, I don't have enough time and I don't want to drop something. Well, what are your views on that? Should we be asking teachers to drop things? You could argue, do people need to write if everyone uses a computer 90% of the time? Is that something that you'd say, maybe we don't need to spend so many time with a pen and pencil because actually 90% of the world uses a keyboard? I don't know.
I'm like, that's a really good question. And I don't think writing is the thing to drop.
Good. Okay. Yeah, let's not do that.
Let's not do that one. But I think some of the elements are the depth of biology and chemistry. And I love the biology and chemistry courses. But I think it's like those should be more as electives of, hey, there are these other fields of technology and engineering. And so when you go through a high school curriculum, it's like you could pick biology, chemistry, computer science should also be a like really established elective, computer science, and then engineering, and then physics, of course. And some of those should definitely be required as like the key components. Like I think physics should be required. But like then the rest of them should be like a mix and match of, hey, you have to pick 4 of these out of 6 or 7. But then at the same time, like if a student wanted to, because typically you have free electives, you could like potentially fit all 7 into your set of courses.
So it is interesting because I think what you're saying is you're building the tools to enable this happen at a mass scale, right? Because now you're not relying on a curious, passionate person in engineering to live in your neighborhood who steps up and say, okay, I'm tired of working in my company and I want to become a teacher. But now you're equipping that high school teacher who doesn't have that background to be able to give this elective course and make it maybe interesting for him or her.
That's exactly the hope. And I want to emphasize one thing. Like, I know I put down biology and chemistry a little, and I love biology and chemistry, but one of the things I question it a little bit for absolutely love chemistry, but like things like the depth that the high school course goes into of like stoichiochemistry. So did I use stoichiochemistry in my day-to-day life today? And it's like, most people will probably say no, they did not use stoichiochemistry. But so it's this thing of like equating which skills are most common to show up in your career.
Yeah.
And I think some of the engineering skills are more typical to find their way, especially computer science is almost definitely going to there are so many computer science careers out there versus like chemistry that requires stoichiochemistry. That's not a lot of careers out there.
Right. It is interesting, but it almost feels that you're saying that as the world gets more complicated, it's supposed to have a single standard. Maybe we should have more electives in there so we can maybe lower the general knowledge or the definition of what general knowledge should be and maybe allow people to follow their passions and opt into things as opposed to forcing them down things like, for example, I was never very good at languages, and when I had to learn a third language at school, it was like, man, a third language.
A third language. That's
and
a
I was
lot.
like, okay, I don't want to do that anymore. Maybe someone should have taught me how to run a balance sheet, or I don't know, pay my taxes at high school, perhaps.
Exactly. I know. Financial literacy is another thing that's like, why are people not taught financial literacy? Yeah. And I think that's exactly it. I don't want to say biology and chemistry should be dropped because they definitely should not be. But it's a question of like, hey, there are other priorities in the career workplace that are like, hey, maybe these priorities could be higherly placed. Like computer science should almost be a necessary for all students. And I think the other part about that is to say before a high school student selects their electives that they go into, there should also be an intro of a set of videos to be like, hey, this elective, you'll be learning about how chemical equations work, how batteries work, how to balance chemical reactions and things like that. So that before you actually select the elective, you could be like, oh, I want to learn more about this and learn more about this in depth. And then there would be another like 20, 30-minute video that would be like, hey, in this exploring technology and CPU architecture, we're going to dive into how computers work and how transistors are used to build logic gates, and logic gates are used to build like multiplication circuits.
You touched on a whole bunch of different topics there. So do you have a favorite video that you can describe, and can you give an overview of what that video was about?
Yeah, so I'd say I have two favorite topics. The older one would definitely be how a solid-state drive works, and the newer one is how video game graphics work. So which one would you want to hear?
So let's go for solid-state drives. I think that's cool.
Yeah, so solid-state drives are incredibly fascinating because they're nanoscopically manufactured structures of charge trap flash is what the current technology is, which is similar to floating gate transistors. I don't like to use technical words frequently in my videos, though I do like things like charge trap, where you're like, oh, hey, I understand what the word charge is, and I understand what a trap is, so I can work those two words together. But regardless, solid-state drives was probably one of the earlier videos I made that really reached a wider audience, and it's simply because people are like, oh, I know what solid-state drives are, but I have no clue how they store information. So this video dives into the physical structure of solid-state drives and like understanding that it's like this massive array of charge trap flash cells, and there are like thousands of cells wide by 128 cells tall by thousands of cells deep. Each of these cells stores charge in what's called the charge trap, and it changes the voltage at which the transistor turns on. So it like impedes the voltage, and by storing different levels of charge in the charge trap, you can change the threshold voltage at which the transistor turns on. And when you change the threshold voltage, then you can store data in the transistor itself.
So I think that's a super cool thing. And if you look at that video, it is very powerful the way that you use animation. So you said earlier Blender. So this idea of zooming into things, because back in the day, maybe some of the compute scientists are curious. You'd open up your computer, your desktop, and you'd have a hard drive, right? And there was this kind of round thing, and there was these needles, and you had to be super careful. But then there was this huge breakthrough of the SSD, and then everybody started using it. The price of these things came down. The amount of storage and the speed of access was significantly superior. But the average person buying a computer really didn't know what on earth was going on. And the way that you used animation is a revelation. You really zoom into this. So can you maybe explain, why did you actually choose this as a topic, right? So were you like bored one day looking at your computer and say, okay, let me choose a random component here that my friends have got no idea how it works. I'm just going to tear it apart and figure out how it works. Maybe a bit like a mechanical engineer would tear apart an engine. Tell me the reasoning behind it.
That's a great question. And it all comes down to the fact that I like to have accurate 3D models of the various objects that I present and show. The first model that is used for the first 20 or so videos is just my LG V10 smartphone that had died. So my old smartphone that was like, hey, let's put this to a new life. So I tore apart that smartphone. Every single component was opened up. I even desoldered and removed all the chips from it so that I could get a clean scan of the printed circuit board on the inside. I spent about a month accurately 3D modeling the LG V10. Then I went through the various components of the smartphone and did a video topic on this component. So I had started with a video on the camera, and then the speaker, and then the touch screen display, and then the solid state drive, and then the system on a chip, the SoC, which is like the CPU, but for a smartphone, but has multiple components in it. So it's just going through the various parts of a smartphone. I simply chose a smartphone both because it was accessible and relatively easy to model compared to something like a car, which is incredibly difficult to model accurately to 5% accuracy. The second reason is that it's something that's very accessible. Like everyone knows what a smartphone is and what it does, but not many people really know how it actually works. Those are the three elements that go into a lot of videos, is things that people know what they are and what they do, but they don't know how it works.
So then you described the solid state with a nice level of accuracy, but when you say 95% accurate, most videos on YouTube don't go to the level of what you did. You really zoom in and you go to individual layers. When you say there are thousands of layers and hundreds up, most people don't realize that chips are multiple layers in the first place, and you keep zooming into an incredible amount of detail. How did you do that? Did you get a special microscopes? Did you do research? Tell me a little bit about how do you go from unmantling or disassembling your mobile phone to this, 30-minute of incredible awesomeness animation. How much work goes in there, and how do you get to that level of accuracy?
That is definitely the research side of things. I do for every single video. If I for the very complicated videos, which is like how solid state drives work, how video game graphics work, how microchips are manufactured, these topics take easily a solid month. And I do this full time, so 40 hours a week. Plus, more than that, like a month of that, of just researching, reading textbooks is a big part of it. Another interesting thing is reading PhD theses on topics, because PhD students have really good skills at writing introductions for like common people, versus some textbooks are like very dense, and they start dense and they just are dense throughout. I also watch other people's YouTube videos, but typically not a lot of my information comes from there because it's not really that deep. And like for how solid state drives work, sometimes I watch like college courses, but for the how solid state drives work, it's not, there weren't really great college courses on it because it's much more of like a master's level topic or PhD topic. So specifically, the solid state drive video was a set of 3 textbooks that I read through. And one of the textbooks had really good visuals. And so those visuals were for like a smaller version that was like 8 by 8 by 16. And so I just scaled it up to the accurate numbers in the 3D models to make it like 50,000 by 10,000 by 128 tall for the cells of the charge strap flash.
So it's interesting that you say that, because even an electrical engineer or a computer scientist, I don't think many courses go to that level of detail. So it feels like as an engineer, people get taught essentials or the fundamentals, but then when it comes to anything that is really made, there's a typical thing, oh, that's an industry problem, it's too complicated. And the way that you're describing it, so I remember at university, people explained how hard drives work, and there were zeros and ones, and there was a thing spinning around, and there was a needle, and you had to be careful, and if you shook it too much, and there was a control algorithm to control the needle, and I got the gist of that, but we didn't go into too much detail of which control algorithm. How does it actually mean, and what does it mean, a scratch, and how do disks have a lifespan? And now you're doing the same thing, but on steroids, but yet you're still explaining it to someone who hasn't got maybe an engineering degree. So the fact that you do that is awesome. But how do you find the courage to go and read 3 additional textbooks on a subject to keep going that deep, as opposed to the natural way of just keeping it interesting enough for people to watch?
I think it's pretty rewarding. And also, I think this level of detail introduced at a high school level is what I personally would have loved to watch as a 17/18-year-old student. Pretty much all the videos I make are like, hey, what would Teddy at 18 like really loved and be curious about? And like that, yeah, this is the video I would make for myself 17 years ago.
Very nice. Yeah. So it's very inspiring. But you also named this branch education. So I'm curious, why did you call it branch education? And why a branch? Why a tree? Walk me through the ideology there.
Of course. So there are 2 key ideas for branch education, or at least 2 key ideas for the naming of branch education. The first is the tree of knowledge, and hearkening to nature and tree of knowledge sort of sense, which is just like, hey, I thought branch is a good short name and branch education is a good long name. Like a little bit of an Apple sort of vibe-ish, something nature-y, also early in the alphabet. But then the second key thing is that when a young kid asks a question of like, hey, how do computers work? And then you try to answer it, there isn't one answer to explain how computers work. If you go down the route of let's talk about binary and ones and zeros, then it's like there's still 30 other answers to explain how computers work to get the whole picture. Or if you go down logic gates, then then you have to also explain how binary works.
Yeah.
So like when you actually try to answer a question of like how do computers work, it's actually starts forming a set of branches of like, okay, let's explain binary, and then let's explain transistors and logic gates, and then let's get into computer architecture and the CPU, and then hey, we're explaining the CPU. Now we got to explain the GPU or the graphics card, and then hey, now we explained all these components in the desktop computer. Now we got to explain like how networking works, because what's a computer without the internet? And then once you explain how networking works and all these components of the computer, then you're like, gotta explain how video game graphics works and how different algorithms work. Like, how do computers work? It's like you're probably wondering how video game graphics work. So once you start diving into an individual question, it's actually much more realistic to explain a whole branch of questions from there. And that's where branch education came from.
No, because I think that's actually a source of knowledge, right? So I see a pattern, or remember a pattern, at least at university, was always those folk who ask that extra question, right? So you can be happy enough with, okay, a phone is a phone and it works and you can talk to it and someone else hears. And that's enough. But if you ask the question of, okay, so how does my voice turn into something digital, and how does it get sent across the planet, and then how's it stored, and is it being cut up, and then there's a whole bunch of chips, and what is a chip, and how are these chips manufactured? So I recognize that pattern that I think is part of an engineering education, to continuously challenge yourself and ask how things work. And the people who did that, who showed more curiosity than others, I seem to always got better grades. I was like, oh, is that what I'm supposed to do?
It's true. Just continuously being curious and asking question upon question is, yeah. I actually was definitely that kind of student that would always ask the really sharp questions and be like, okay, I don't 100% understand this, and here's the key question in your lesson that is like the linchpin to help me and probably the entire class better understand what you're talking about.
But is that also why you chose Blender like as an animation / simulation? Because in engineering, it's quite a common thing that you get taught the value of simulating something, right? So certain things you can't build, or it's expensive to build, so therefore you simulate it, and then it gives you a bit of a deeper understanding of what will happen. Is that why you chose Blender to show these animations, to make it more visual? Or
I'd say it's like 50% because I'm bad in front of a camera, or like never really trained up my skills to talk to a camera, and 50% because once I realized I was bad in front of a camera, I was like, hey, actually, engineering is like a lot of devices and a lot of technical things and like very small components like the transistors inside a computer, and those are things that like diagrams will not do proper justice. So just the fact that engineering is lots of 3D structure pushed me towards creating animation. In the future, we have plans for branch education to use a lot of our 3D models and simplify them and push them into a video game format where if a student was curious, they could have the entire 3D model of a desktop computer and in a video game format, dive into it and open up the various components. It's actually not that hard once we have the models and we have the 3D models.
So that sounds super interesting. So is that kind of like the analogy that you sometimes see a mechanical engineer, mechanical-minded person, which would often, you hear these stories of taking apart a motor or a car engine and then in the garage not being able to put it again together, and you can empowering the rest of the world to do that for things. I don't know, microchips are not so easy to tear apart and unsolder in a clean and easy way.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, actually, the dream is to also get more into mechanical engineering and have a full, accurate 3D model of an automobile. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because I always think like the best way to learn about how a car works is to physically take it apart and put it back together, like all the engine and the brakes and the various pumps and valves and things like that, just take it apart and put it back together, is then you really get an understanding of how the various pieces work together. But at the same time, practically no one has a spare car to do that with or the space to do it with. Less like no one. I have never seen a garage where they're like, oh yeah, come and take apart a car for educational purposes.
Just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But the way that you're saying things, there's something I want to ask your opinion about. You say mechanical engineering, but a car is not just a mechanical device. The role of software is increasingly more important, but also in your videos, it feels that you touch upon more fundamental physics level of how chemicals and chemistry play a role. So do you have a view on how to truly understand how many different fields do you really need to master? Is that what you're trying to also bridge the gap between degrees courses?
I think definitely in the future, there still, of course, will be mechanical engineering degrees and electrical engineering degrees and all these other degrees. But like engineering college and high school is like much more of a place where you learn how to learn and not really let's learn these specific set of skills. What I learned in college versus what I was using at Applied Materials is like, those are very different skills. And like pretty much everything I used at Applied Materials, I had to learn at the job, learn on the job. So really, when you choose a major for college, it's not necessarily pigeonholing you into that specific thing. It's like just teaching yourself how to learn so that when you get to the job, you're better at learning these entirely new set of skills. And that'll be far more applicable in the future when jobs are changing at an even faster rate. And the college curriculum almost definitely won't be able to stay exactly up to speed with what is needed in the workplace. So it's much more about just learning the skills to learn so you can better adjust to the ever-changing job force, job requirements.
So I want to unpack something you said there. So you're saying it's almost like education is changing in the sense that you said the value was to learn how to learn. Can you maybe speak a little bit from personal experience of what you learned at, I don't know, university, that you then said, oh, I really never needed to learn that. And actually the key benefit was this critical thinking. So is this what school should be teaching? Critical thinking and learning how to absorb information versus the information itself?
I don't think I'd say critical thinking. Yes, critical thinking is very important, but learning how to work with equations. A good example is like even more specific is electrical engineering. Like I took an entire course on RF, radio frequency wave, which I never used, but still it is useful to understand how RF is propagated, how wireless system works and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I remember when I was studying electrical engineering, I actually made the choice because I understood it, I liked it, I was curious about it, but I really had no idea what a control engineer really was. So I had a few friends that I looked up to and I understood the math and it was straightforward. I liked electricity. Okay, this is cool. And then I learned later in my degree, there was something called, you could specialize in control theory. And I was like, what is control theory? Does a control engineer get a job? And what type of job does a control engineer get? I was like, this is just fun. I want to dig a little bit deeper. And in hindsight, I wish I had a bit more concrete examples. And I remember asking my professors and teachers saying, but okay, we're learning about these sensors and actuators, and where is this? How does this work? And I always felt I had a suboptimal answer there. Is that what you're trying to really change with branch education, that people have real life concrete things that say, okay, this is really why you're studying maths or why this compound knowledge is important?
Yeah, that's definitely seeing the application of engineering in the real world is one of the key tenets of branch education. And to really getting a sense of, hey, this sort of algorithm, hey, we use it all the time in our smartphone, like compression algorithm used all the time. Or just understanding different types of transistors and the basic equations that transistors are derived from are used on all the various transistors in your smartphone.
So when I was at university, pivoting moment for myself was this technical computing, right? I remember growing up and sciences in high school, people would say there's some theory. So that would mean equations, or there was this theory that you had to prove, and I could understand that. And then there was always this experimental side of things. So this was more on the biology things. You drop an apple and it falls. This is an experiment. You're testing a hypothesis. But what for me made a big difference was the idea that there was this third pillar of technical computer to simulate things and program it. But you seem to be taking this to the extreme where you're not necessarily using MATLAB, Python, and optimization problems, and you're not going down there, but you really are looking at how simulating and visualizing it can make things better. Is this kind of fourth branch of how people should think of the world?
I don't know if I'd think of it as a fourth branch necessarily, but I think it is more towards a visualization of a problem. So when I was working at Applied Materials, I would have to debug issues, and visualizing the entire system inside the ion implanter. I was working on the wafer handling system, visualizing the various motors and encoders and how they're all situated inside the wafer handling system, the robotic arms, as well as the rotating platen, is something that branch education is trying to support when you work on engineering devices or mechanical systems. You require a lot of visual sense and seeing how all the different elements fit together. Maybe it is a fourth thing of visualization mechanical systems rather than just theory and equations, but maybe.
Yeah. So it seems that you're onto something because you're certainly very popular. You've made, I don't know, over 40 videos. You've got nearly 2 million subscribers. So you're obviously doing something which is appealing to the general world. I'm a bit curious of maybe some of the future topics that you've got going. So you mentioned some things. Do you want to peel away the layers of the onion of what's to come next? Have you got this pipeline ready? How many more videos can we expect from you? What does this look like?
So for how many videos overall you can expect from me, I think I have a limitless supply of topics I can get into, simply because the world of engineering is so deep. I want to get into things like networking, how networks work. I'm currently focusing on computer architecture and transistors and how transistors are organized. Then I'll get into CPUs and processors and cores and the architecture of cores and pipelining. The near term is computers. The far term is all these other general topics of engineering. Another big one is AI and neural networks, diving into the exact structure and mathematics around how you're talking to a chatbot. How was this chatbot trained? What are the specific algorithms used to train it? Other things I want to dive into are quantum computers. One thing I always dislike is when other YouTube channels are like, oh yeah, qubits are just like bits, but they can be any state. And it's a lot more complicated than that. I think this is an oversimplification, and you're just not diving into the exact mechanics of qubits because you don't entirely understand all the depth of it.
So I think that it's super interesting that you do this, but in the back of my mind is how does a single individual capture all of this? This is like a life learning experience. Is it just you, or are you beginning to branch out with having a platoon of people helping you do this research?
Currently, the research and the script writing is entirely on me. I have a team of now 5 animators who are working at the animation side of things and the visuals. The research definitely takes a lot of time. The plan is to hire additional researchers and scriptwriters, but we're just not yet there.
And maybe just from my understanding, so your videos look super polished. I'm assuming that it's just not the first one and maybe 1 or 2 iterations. How many iterations do each of your videos go through?
We edit immensely. We just go through dozens and dozens of edits for every single section. The script alone has around 40 edits per script to really... It's actually a very different style of writing a script because every single sentence I have to visualize in my head what it would look like in 3D. Mm-hmm. And I have to actively stay away from conceptual sentences saying engineering is a difficult topic is a conceptual sentence, because it's how do you animate something that says engineering is a difficult topic or a fun topic or whichever direction you want to go, but that doesn't have concrete visualizations behind it.
Wow.
Yeah.
But so you make the script and then you make the animations? Is that it? So I guess you do the research, you make the script, and then you make the animations, and then do your animation crew team say, "Hey, Teddy, what on earth are you talking about? What is this thing you just described? An atom? I don't understand."
Essentially, yeah. So I do all the research at the beginning, and then I write the script. And then once I finalize the script, I send it to our narrator, and we have another guy who does the narration. And then he records it, and then we start the animation once all the narration is completed. While I'm doing the research and script writing, the 3D modeler, I send him some of the things that we'll need modeled. Sometimes I have to ship him, because he lives in India, I ship him the graphics card or whichever device, which is surprisingly expensive, I'll tell you. Shipping from the United States to India is more expensive than I like it to be. But he gets started on the modeling, and then once we get the models ready, once we get the audio from the script ready, then we start animating. And then pretty much for about 2 months straight, I work with the animators at just like giving them feedback, multiple PowerPoint presentations of feedback, and also calls, lots of calls, and discussing, hey, I'm thinking it's going this way, as well as storyboards we have, and then just fine-tuning the visuals to make them both technically accurate as well as aesthetically appealing, and then also focusing on the clarity of the lesson.
Wow. Do you start off one of these things saying my learning objectives are like A, B, and C, like you do it in an educational course? Or is it more, how do you nail into the narrative to get it so crisp? That's tough.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it all starts out with a good outline of the topic, and really seeing the one we recently released was how microchips are manufactured. And it's just like, hey, these are the different bullets I want to hit throughout the video. I actually list them out. All the bullets I list out on cutout pieces of 3x5 note cards.
Yeah.
And then I cut out all the different bullets, and then I go to my dining room table and assemble them, and then have larger groups of topics. So essentially drafting an outline with all the things I want to cover, how they fit together, and then I have an outline, and then I write the script from that.
Wow, that's super impressive. I think it's underestimated how much work goes in behind the scenes. I guess you could say the same thing for most movies that take 3 hours, and there's platoons of people behind the scene to make.
Yeah.
So the same thing goes for you, I guess. So that's very interesting. Maybe then, just as a question, if you were to give advice to your younger self, would you tell your younger self to do something different?
Buy Bitcoin?
Yeah, so aside by buying Bitcoin and investing in Apple, I don't know.
That's a good question. Would I continue doing engineering? And I would definitely continue doing engineering. I actually love like creating these videos and love working for branch education, as well as there needs to be a high school engineering curriculum. So I'm like, hey, I'm doing good work because I'm filling something that is needed in this world. But I think if I were to redo a few things, I would consider majoring a little bit differently. And I would consider majoring in physics and then doing a PhD in applied physics, which essentially is engineering. But I think one of my gaps in understanding is really some of the higher level physics equations. So I'm like, hey, I think I would have filled that gap, because it's easier to go from a very complicated thing down to a simpler thing, but it's a lot harder to go from a simpler topic to a more complicated topic.
But so it's interesting you said, but would you have, so you're now a YouTuber, would you have told yourself to have started YouTubing sooner, or would you have quit your engineering job sooner to do that? Or would you have told your younger self, you know what, maybe studying, you don't need to do all these degrees to understand the way the world works and discover the power of libraries in the first place?
No, definitely. I would actually, now that I edited it again, if I could do it, I would do physics plus mechanical and or electrical engineering, because I think like the multiple degrees is very critical in getting understanding like this field and this other field. And it's not specifically like about staying in one thing. It's about understanding the hybridization of like how different fields can be applied together to make a new topic. So yeah, I would tell my younger self to be more ambitious. And then it's also interesting that you talk about starting branch education earlier because I think it was easier to start a YouTube channel in 2014 or 2013, just because the algorithm was a little bit more lenient for giving views and subscribers. So it would have been easier, but at the same time, like I had a lot of fun working for Applied Materials. And if branch education completely bombed, then I would definitely consider going back because I don't know. I think working in semiconductor fabs is, for one, there are no allergies there because it's pretty much the cleanest room in the world. But two, it's just a really fun job where you get to work on some of the most complicated technological machines there are.
The other thing that I wanted to ask you is, do you have a view on this going very deep in a subject? I remember people used to say, you go to university, you go deep in a subject, and you do a PhD to become an expert in your field, that the true mastery is to become the best in the world or the top 10% in the world of a certain subject. But the way you're articulating things is you're saying that maybe not everyone should do that. There's maybe a bigger win of crossing borders between fields. Is that a true statement that I'm hearing in between the lines there? What are your views here?
Oh yeah, I strongly believe that hybridization of different like majors, combining them together to have like mechanical engineering, and like the more different they are, the more interesting combinations you could get. So like a good example is Steve Jobs has talking about how his strong influence in typography and how he took calligraphy courses at his brief college stint at Reed, how it like greatly impacted his sense of aesthetics when designing the fonts of the early Apple computers. And that's a perfect example of like, this technology, like perhaps one of the most savvy technology guys in his day and one of the most savvy businessmen in his day. And then it's like this other completely like out of the nowhere thing of calligraphy helped drastically improve his product. And that's what I think of branch education as. Hey, I have a classic training in mechanical and electrical engineering, and then I have real world work experience in semiconductor industry. But then I bring in this completely left field thing of animation, and then I have a completely new product.
So if people want to reach out to you, how should they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I have a website, www.branch.education, and it's not .com, it's actually at the .education is the like suffix, and so it's just www.branch.education, and then I have my various videos on there that link to the YouTube, but then I also have reach out to me.
And are you looking for help in any particular areas?
Not necessarily. Probably 6 months back, I could have hired more animators, but now we hired more animators, and now we're getting them into our workflow. We always can use assistance with the various technical aspects. So any technical experts who are like, hey, I work very deeply with computer architecture, and I would be happy to proofread your scripts and make sure that your scripts are on track. That's always a help, but at the same time, not everyone is always interested in assisting with that.
You'd be surprised. Sometimes a simple ask can go a long way. Teddy, you're a very inspiring kind of guy, and you've got these wonderful ideas of cool projects. But is there any kind of fun fact that you think about that would drive future decisions of your episodes that you're building?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. One thing I was researching, I've been researching a lot of GPUs because I'm working on a GPU architecture video, and I found that the most powerful computer in the year 2000 was the ASCII White, and it was around like 7 teraflops of computing power, which is essentially 7 trillion operations a second. One crazy fact I found was that the 1080 Ti graphics card, which came out in 2016, 16 years after the ASCII White, has essentially the equivalent computing power as the supercomputer. So there's a 16-year gap between the most powerful computer in the world, which costs like multiple millions of dollars. It required 3 megawatts of power to run it and another 3 megawatts of power to cool it, versus a graphics card from 16 years later is the same computing power.
This is a great place to stop this episode. I hope it triggered your curiosity in some shape or form of how MATLAB, Python, or Julia are actually used in the real world. If you did find it interesting, just subscribe in your favorite podcast player. And while you're at it, write a review, as this will help the podcast going strong. In addition to that, don't be shy, share it with a couple of friends, as who knows, one of them might be a future guest on Inspiring Computing. Thank you.